and welcome to your Chapter 3 lecture for this course. Today we are going to focus on the themes of art. So moving along, as we talk about the themes of art throughout this chapter, we will learn to compare representations of the sacred realm. We will identify how works of art reflect politics and the social order. We will explain the story or history represented in works of art. We will describe how artists represent everyday life. We will also discuss how art is used to reflect on the human experience. We will focus on the recognition of invention and fantasy in art. We will characterize the representation of the natural world in art and restate how artists respond to art and its institutions. So, as we move into the first concept, we're going to be talking about the sacred realm. So, when we talk about the sacred realm, there are some questions we can ponder about. Who made the universe? How did life begin? What is its purpose, essentially? And what happens to us after we die? For many of those answers and other questions, people throughout history have turned to a world where we cannot see except through faith. The sacred realm of the spirits, gods and goddesses, spirits of ancestors, spirits of nature, one God and one alone. Each society has formed its own view of the sacred realm and how it interacts with our own. There have been some faiths that have disappeared into history, others have remained small and local, while still others, such as Christianity and Islam, have become major religions that draw believers from all over the world. From many earliest times, art has been an important role in our relationship with our religious and sacred realm here. So as we kind of look into these next few slides, we're going to talk about that a little bit more. So the first image that we're going to look at, this is the interior of the upper chapel of the Saint Chapel in Paris. This was taken between 1243 and 1248. So the chapel was commissioned in 1239 by the French King Louis the Ninth to house an important collection of relics that he had just acquired. Relics he believed to be pieces of the true cross, the crown of thorns, and other instruments of Christ's passion. The king's architect created a soaring vertical space whose walls seemed to be made of stained glass. As you look as the light passing through the glass, it creates this almost kind of dazzling effect. To me, it reminds me if you've ever had like the kaleidoscope, or like when you were a kid you could turn. That's kind of the effect that it gives me. And I think both the indoor lighting, especially as you can see in this image, as well as the outdoor lighting, kind of that idea of transparency, is what gives that kind of dazzling effect to it. And it makes it seem, a lot of people said it kind of reminds them of the glory of heaven itself, kind of that light and that mystification. And I can see that as well. I can see the use of the colors within the stained glass and the adornment, especially if you look at this image, you can see the golds and blues and things, and the way that the light is reflective, and then all the people gathered here. It could definitely, and then this one has a little bit more of a dim setting, but you can definitely see here the reflections and how that light, it does kind of have a heavenly presence to it, very sacred, and it seems like the heavens are very kind of close at hand, and I think that's very interesting. As you can tell here as well in the picture that people are very close together. It's a very intimate space because it was intended as a private chapel for the king and his court. As we, if you compare this to some other mosque and other sacred realms or establishments around the area, you may notice that they were built to serve their communities during this time, and for people to have a place to go and to enjoy their sacred realm and to enjoy their beliefs and their faith in a space that was their own. If you look here a little bit closer, even you can see the adornment of all the images in this stained glass here as well. And it's very captivating. I think this picture, especially this kind of altar-like sense, it kind of gives that sense of that heavenly realm like we talked about as well. So this image as well deals with some of the sacred realms. This is the Madonna enthroned. It's a tempera on wood. This was created by the 13th century Italian master Ciambue. And it depicts Mary, the mother of Christ, with her son, while in the last chapter we saw the Christ adorned by shepherds. In this painting, the infant and his mother sit tranquilly on a throne. The gold background pieces place them within a heavenly realm. Mary's right hand indicates the Christ child, who raises his own right hand in a gesture of benediction. On both sides of her are these angels and heavenly spirits, again, all wearing these very shimmering gold halos signifying their holiness. So as we look at this, we can kind of see, once again, that sacred realm. She's placed on an altar with the Son, and you've got all these biblical figures, and then you've got the holiness around it as well. So artists, even from their separate point of views, so even if they weren't necessarily doing Christian art, which we'll talk about here in just a minute, had a way of portraying their sacred realm and how they wanted their artworks to be interpreted, maybe not only for the people who experienced or practiced that type of faith or religion or spiritual being. They also wanted people who were maybe outsiders, or people who were maybe questioning, or people maybe who weren't sure, or people who were not sure which pathway they wanted to take. It was a way to also kind of promote religion and spiritual pathways at the time. So we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go to these next few slides. So the Last Supper is a pretty well-known artwork in general by Leonardo. This work is very interesting, to say the least, because, even if you're not very familiar with Christian theology, most people kind of know the simple background story behind this. Christ is having his final meal with his apostles before Judas then identifies Christ to the authorities. And he's like, one of you will betray me. You can see even artistically how everything is centered around Christ here. So when we talk about the composition, essentially, not only that the sacredness behind the artwork, but we talk about the composition of the artwork as well. We see this kind of triangle that forms behind the Christ body. Obviously, he's the center focal point. So when we talk about perspective, you'll kind of understand that a little bit more as well. But there's this idea, if you look in the background, a lot of people kind of put this past them, this kind of very verdant landscape beyond the windows, which is often interpreted as a paradise. So it's often kind of seen as this heavenly sanctuary. So if we look back to the chapel, that's a physical, most people would interpret that, but they may not necessarily interpret something like a field or a landscape to necessarily be spiritual, or be considered a heavenly sanctuary. But this idea was that this heavenly sanctuary can only be reached through Christ, and they can pass over into that heavenly realm once they have reached him. So in comparison, if we look at some of these Buddhist temples, these are also very serene, holy figures in terms of Buddhism. So we've been talking about kind of Christian theology and Christianity. So in comparison, we look at Buddhism. So this particular location here, this is the Bora Borda, and it focuses on the path of Buddhism. And the idea of a pathway is an essential concept in Buddhism. If you look at it kind of like we're looking at it from the aerial view, especially in the top portion up here, you can almost kind of see the representation of a mandala. And the idea is moving from the darkness into the light, which is one of the final final elements of one of the experiences here. So the idea, you can kind of see people navigating here. The idea is to navigate up here and to experience that enlightenment as part of the Buddhism journey and culture. The symbolism of enlightenment that the stupas represented was not merely to be aesthetic, but it was also to be understood as spiritual technologies that harness these spiritual energies in this creation of a sacred space. So each of these miniature stupas harnessed their own type of spiritual or sacred energy within this realm. A lot of times, especially people who are Buddhist, as they retreat towards the top of that part of enlightenment, they will kind of walk around. The term is circumambulate. And they'll walk around, they may be chanting prayers, they may say prayers to themselves silently, and they'll kind of enjoy and experience that sacred realm here as they journey through their path. If you are not Buddhist and you're just kind of observing, obviously this is more of a tourist site at the time now, but a lot of times it is you'll see people become very quiet, and it becomes very interesting actually how they are just very respectful, even if they maybe don't understand, the process and the pathways of Buddhism. how they're very respectful of that. And then moving on to the Todaji, this is located in Japan. It also translates as the Great Eastern Temple. And this was a very interesting, this was actually built twice. So they say that it was so wonderful in terms of what it represented that they felt like they had to rebuild it twice to make sure that it was sturdy and was useful to the public and to the community. So this particular monument intermingles both Buddhism and the politics of early Japan. There was a little bit of controversy with that as this was being built, and then there were some other statistics that went into place, and so this one kind of brought it back. And like I said, because they built it twice, it's supposed to be kind of very important to show how important sacred realms such as this, no matter the religious, spiritual, or faithful belief, how they're important to be placed not only for people who are maybe currently on those pathways of their spiritual journey, but also for people to understand the history behind them. Okay, moving on. So now we're going to be talking about politics and the social order. So things we create as human beings, most basic and important, of the things we create as human beings, one of the most basic and important may be society. So just a couple questions to think about here for just a minute. How can a stable, just, and productive society best be organized? Who will rule and how? What freedoms will those rulers have? What freedoms will the citizens have? How will wealth be distributed to all? How will the authority be maintained? So many of these questions we can understand throughout history, and a lot of those have been reflected in artistic pieces, whether they be 2D visual works or sculptures. And I think that's a very interesting concept. So if we look here, we've talked about the Great Pyramids in Giza briefly before in some of our other lectures, but as we reflect on it now, when Pharaoh died, it was believed that he rejoined the gods and became fully divine. So one of the famous of these monuments that he prepared for this journey for, that he would need to maintain his royal lifestyle in eternity. And that was created through this monument. And that was one of the 3 pyramids at Giza, which served as the tomb of the pharaoh. Thousands of years later, the scale of these structures is still very awe-inspiring for many. The largest pyramid originally reached a height of about 480 feet, roughly the height of a 50-story skyscraper, and its base covered more than 13 acres. So the pyramids, in terms of their size and also we talked about this a little bit with art and purpose, especially being used for human purpose. The pyramids reflect this immense power of the pharaohs, of how they would command these forces, but also reflected the beliefs that underlie the social order that granted the ruler such power in the first place. So there was this idea that this safe passageway to the afterlife would be created, and the worship thereafter as a god himself was essential for the prosperity of the country and the continuity of the universe. Visitors to the Pyramid of Giza originally would arrive by water, disembarking first at one of the temples that sat along the riverbank. Each of the pyramids actually had their own. And from there, they would have walked along a raised causeway to a second temple. And the temples themselves contained numerous shrines to the dead pharaoh, each with their own life-size statue of him. Statues kind of lined the causeway, and they were used inside the pyramids themselves. So before this kind of modern mass media, it was art that was used to kind of project the presence and authority of rulers to the people throughout their lands. They didn't have machines that could make these mass copies, or they couldn't distribute things via the internet or social media. So it was the ideas of monuments or buildings or structures or artworks themselves that allowed sculptors to kind of create these monuments and to have these political contributions and partnerships along with social order for the rulers and the kings and queens and the authority figures of that time. So as we look at some of these next figures, this is the equestrian statue of Marcus Aurelius, done between 161 to 80 CE. This is a gilded bronze. So one of the finest of these ancient Roman works to come down to is a bronze sculpture, or excuse me, statue of the Emperor Marcus Aurelius. Seated on the mount, he extends his arm in a gesture as if delivering a speech. He has a very calm kind of victory in contrast with the spirited hope of his horse. You can see that he's kind of more in a mellow stance, but his horse is kind of more in a movement stance, which was originally shown raising his hoof over a fallen enemy. But the Roman fashion for beards came and went like all fashions, and the emperor's beard in the statue is a significant detail and part of the way in which he wanted to be portrayed. Oftentimes, beards were associated with Greek philosophers, and the beard here used on the figure Marcus Aurelius signals his desire to be seen as a philosopher and king, which was an ideal he genuinely lived up to. So, as we look at this also goes along with the ideas of politics and social order. We can see that art remained deeply involved with politics and social order. The perspective of the artist changed, but they would still use these very powerful images. And even though the artists were probably typically citizens, they were not necessarily connected highly to these authority figures, but the way that they portrayed them made them seem like gods and goddesses. The kings and the queens that they were, these emperors, and made them, literally, as we see here, put them on a pedestal. And so I think that's very interesting. Delacroix is a very interesting work. The artist Eugene Delacroix, his work, Liberty Leading the People, is a very interesting work. This is oil on canvas, actually. He painted, actually, the work on his own without a patron. There was definitely a lot of support for the artist's support of the revolution in 1830, which was a popular uprising in Paris paintings in the very same year. You see the figures, you see the Greek statue kind of coming to life, holding the French flag high, and she kind of rallies the citizens of Paris that surge towards us with sabers and pistols, almost as if they're about to burst out of the painting. So when the painting was displayed to the public in 1831, it was bought by none other than Louis Philippe, the citizen king that the revolution had put into power. But perhaps the image was a little too revolutionary for the new king, as he returned the painting to the artist just a few months later. It did not go on public permanent display until many years later in 1863, and that kind of was significant in terms of politics at this time as well, and kind of that idea of social order and hierarchy. Picasso's artwork, Guernica, was also very significant in terms of politics and social order. At the time, Picasso himself was a Spaniard working in Paris and had been commissioned by the government to paint a mural for the Spanish pavilion of the Paris World's Fair of 1937. He often procrastinated about fulfilling the commission, and then just days after the news of the bombing reached Paris, he started Guernica and completed it in briefly little over a month. Many people were shocked by this mural investigation. It's very overwhelming in terms of its presence. It's about 25 feet long and 12 feet high. It has very stark, powerful imagery that seems to kind of reach out and engulf the observer. Picasso used no colors. The entire painting is done in black and white. And that's also to kind of echo the idea of the newspaper, black and white newspaper, and the black and white photography, and the idea of war and what was going on. Because a lot of times, a lot of artists, especially during this time period, they didn't necessarily have color that they could use, but sometimes the color, in my opinion, as an artist and as an art teacher and instructor, and just knowing a little bit about history of art, sometimes, if you take a picture on your phone, essentially, and you can change it to more of a black and white tone, you might be like, oh, well, this completely changes the tone. Maybe if there's something with a bright red or a bright orange or some kind of color that might indicate a certain feeling or emotion, and then you transfer or change that to a black and white setting, then it's kind of like, oh, okay, well, this doesn't give the same emotion or effect. So I think one of his main concern, not necessarily concern, I think what he was trying to portray in his artwork was the concern that the photography and the newspapers were kind of dulling necessarily what was occurring during that time, because the citizens were only seeing these images in black and white, and maybe they were not getting and understanding the full concept of what's going on. Instead of maybe blood and red being portrayed in a color image, it was being seen as a darker shade of a gray or a black. You were seeing these different shades and tones of these colors necessarily than the real color itself. And I think that would have had maybe a little bit more impact on the citizens themselves. A little bit of my opinion, a little bit of history and research, but I do think that's an important concept to remember when you're thinking about artworks that were done in black and white. Obviously, most of the time they are intentional, and I think that thinking about those concepts behind that is very interesting as well. Moving on to the next section. So this is about stories and histories. So deeds of heroes, tragic legends, folk tales passed down through many generations, episodes of television shows that everyone knows by heart, where shared stories are just one of the ways that people create these sense of communities. Oftentimes, artists, especially visual artists, will turn to stories for their subject matter. There may be a poem, there may be a document, there may be some kind of story, especially where the roots are really deep into a culture's collective memory. And then, they start to create kind of a narrative, almost like a storyboard, essentially. So the idea is that artists like to take these words and they like to put them into a visual concept or a visual composition. So, maybe there's something talking about war, maybe there's something talking about politics, or maybe there's something talking about love. And instead of just seeing that word and reading it, and there are some people who can be moved or interpret what is going on by the use of words. But a lot of times, to me, art is a universal language. So, in my opinion, and in general, I think when we look at an image, like I've said, it can be subjective. People can have different opinions, but it does speak a universal language. So someone who may be from a different culture, a different background, may speak a different language. You could both be standing and looking at the same picture, and you might get two different understandings, but you can both have the option to interpret it, where if it was a writing done maybe in English and this person did not understand English, that wouldn't be fair that you get to interpret what's going on in the story and they don't understand. Where when you have a picture, everybody kind of paints a picture in their head, at least, of some sort. And when you're visualizing those words, you can think about that as well. So I think that's very interesting. So as we talk about stories in history, we're going to talk about one of these images here. So this is by Judith Baca. This is called Great Wall of Los Angeles, the Frontier, California, 1988, and Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, 1848. It was begun in 1974, and it is a mural painting. So this is a half-long mile history of the area from the prehistoric to the 20th century. And the goal of this ongoing project was to represent the histories of the diverse populations of Los Angeles, who were often underrepresented in history books and school curriculum. The artist collaborated with historians and other artists to picture events that had received little attention but were very deeply affected into people's lives. So I think another thing, we've talked about this in the past as well, how art was used for documentations, like when we talked about the cave paintings in the lecture. People are still doing that today. Things that people are drawing, things that people are writing, things that people are creating, whether it's even digital from the 21st century. For some, that actually might be more beneficial because it can be locked away in a document or an e-file and be used later. But all of these things are documenting what's going on right now. And those may be things that in 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 100 years could be used in a textbook, or could be used in some kind of ebook, or could be used as some kind of database to help us understand these events. So I think this artist in particular was trying to represent that the underrepresented communities and diversities of the communities and cultures within Los Angeles. And I think this was a fantastic way to kind of show a timeline. But instead of just merely writing out a timeline or writing a book or writing it down on a piece of paper, the artist was like, no, I'm going to draw this out. I'm going to create, these pictures. And the thing about pictures too is, young children can see them and understand them, what's going on. You might have to, verbally tell them a story. You might have to explain it to them a little bit. But that's what I was saying about art being a universal language. So I think that's very important as well. So we're going to stop the lecture here, and then I will do a part 2 of this second half of chapter 3.